So down in Cheyenne, I've been at this for a while, watching what's been happening with Wyoming's pension program, and I knew that the state legislator, our legislative body, had been taking some stabs at trying to solve the Wyoming pension problem. But I'm not sure if it was half-hearted or what the case was. But Maureen, Wyoming still has a pension problem, doesn't it?
Yeah, Wyoming, the state of Wyoming has got the same type of pension plan as governments in all kinds of other states, well, all other 50 states pretty much, more or less now, although things are changing in other states, and that's what we're looking to have happen here as well. But also, you've got all kinds of municipalities who have the same fundamental type of pension plan. Now, I think part of the reason why this whole pension issue has become such a big problem is because it's very, very complicated to understand, and so people just sort of they don't want to deal with it. And even legislators, you can see when we had a couple of years ago a bill that brought forward the kind of reform that we're looking for still today, people just didn't understand it well enough, and that bill didn't pass. So what we're sort of looking at is trying to get people to understand, especially legislators, but citizens as well, to understand better how this pension system works, how things have changed in the private sector, how the public sector or the government sector is not following through and sort of following along with these changes in the private sector. Because what we really need to see at the end of the day is pension equity between bureaucrats and taxpayers. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, well, let me try to simplify it, because that's something I love to do. So I'm gonna try to tackle this and tell me how I'm doing. First off, sometime in the future, those people who hope to collect a Wyoming pension will not collect the full pension that they have been promised. How's that?
Well, that could very well be, because as we've seen in other places like Pritchard, Alabama, in Rhode Island, in Detroit, a lot of these government workers, both current and future retirees, who were promised a certain level of pension benefit, are now realizing that that either in the worst case, like in Pritchard, Alabama, for instance, that pension check is not coming at all. Just recently in Detroit, the pensioners agreed to a little snippet of their pension benefit of 4.5%. So it's a 4.5% cut in their pension check every month, which is not really that much, especially when you consider that the state taxpayers are still expected to come up with an $800 million bailout of that particular city, city pension plan. Because what's fundamental here is the type of pension plan that government workers benefit from, that private sector workers virtually don't see at all anymore in the private sector. And that's a really important nuance that people need to understand, because in the government sector what you have is something called a defined benefit pension plan, which means that government workers are promised a certain payment at the time of retirement and throughout the retirement period, sometimes with a cost of living increase, and that benefit comes whether there's money in the fund to pay it or not. Now, as we're seeing, sometimes that or not means that they're not actually going to get it, but a lot of times what it does mean is that you get a reduction in services to people who are paying taxes for those services, or you'll see a tax increase. And I'm going to be writing more about that particular issue in a couple of weeks. But what we see in the private sector, and where the private sector is moving to more and more, is something called a defined contribution plan. And that's like a 401k type of plan, where you have the employee and the employer putting money into something like a mutual fund or an index fund. And in fact, even big-time private investors are moving their own money more and more into these index funds, because an index fund is something that will actually follow the market. So you can actually be with the market the entire time and not be sometimes way above the market, but then again sometimes way below the market. So what we see here in the state, for instance, and this is all throughout this particular mountain geographical area, you've got about 84% of government workers with access to a defined benefit plan, while only about 20% of private sector workers have that same kind of plan. Now, only about 48% of private sector employees at all have a company pension plan, and if the company does have a private sector plan, it has most likely got one of these defined contribution plans. Now, I don't know about you, but through my employer, I don't have a pension plan at all. So that means that my tax dollars are going, instead of funding my own retirement, they're going to fund somebody else's retirement. And what could eventually happen here in Wyoming is we could see a big bailout of those plans because they've got what's called a massive unfunded liability. So that's like a pension debt. So the pension plans are actually in a big debt position. And in Wyoming alone, that debt is about $2 billion. And if you think about it, general fund spending for 2 years in the state is about $3.6 billion. So that pension debt is a huge percentage of our total state general fund spending amount. And this is something that people need to realize.
I'm talking with Maureen from Wyoming Liberty Group. Let me ask you some questions because it's got so much information there, and it can get a little overwhelming. Have we, and I bet you it's all three, but let's find out. Have we overpromised, or are there too many people in the system, or is it that they've overestimated the return for the people who are in the pension systems, or all three?
It's kind of all three. This type of benefit is like a Ponzi scheme. It's like Social Security, And when Social Security was developed back in the 30s, or even when Social Security in the U.S. was developed back in the 30s, but it was actually von Bismarck, a German general, who established the very first Social Security type of plan back in around 1880. And the idea at the time was that, you've got these people. And then the age 65 was set at that time. 1880, age 65 was set because most people didn't live to be 65. So you'd have a number of people that would be pulling benefits out of this great big fund that a huge number of people would be paying into. Demographics have changed over time, and that's why what we've got now are more and more people taking out of this plan and fewer people coming in. Now, a lot of this is all sort of high level math stuff that goes on to figure out a lot of these things. So what happens when we talk about how much the pension is actually in debt, that depends on a lot of assumptions. One of those assumptions is the investment return assumption that you mentioned. Now, just in the last year or so, the investment return assumption was reduced from 8% to 7.75%, and that was a significant improvement, believe it or not, in the way they go about calculating how much the unfunded liability is, because the unfunded liability, when that investment return went down, the liability went way up. So, in other words, the debt went way up, and the unfunded liability went. This is hard to explain on the radio. It's easier if you can have a big chart, right?
Yeah.
So pensioners would have only received 72.8 cents for every dollar that they had been promised after they made that pension return adjustment. Now, in fact, really, the returns, if I could get 7.75% on my investments, I'd give all my money to these guys. Because, of course, they don't actually get that much. So really, the investment assumption should be much lower. But what that would mean is that the unfunded liability would just absolutely skyrocket. So what we need to start doing now is putting some real reforms in place so that we don't have more and more people going into this plan that's becoming less and less viable all the time.
Now, that is one of the solutions that I've heard for the pension problem in any state, not just Wyoming, but as soon as we get to a certain level, then there's got to be a cutoff. In other words, those people who are currently working for the state of Wyoming who are been promised a pension, okay, you're going to get it. But if anybody is hired, let's say tomorrow, there's no more pension for them. We've cut them off. There's a break-off point. Everybody else is going to have to fend for themselves out in the real world like the rest of us. So that's one possible solution.
I don't think that's realistic. I think what we need to see is what I call private sector equity.
All right.
So in the private sector, for most people, when you get a job in a big company, you get certain benefits, and one of those benefits is a pension plan. But it's not a defined contribution pension plan. It's not a defined benefit pension plan. So in other words, you're not promised some specific benefit 30 years down the road. It's defined contribution plan. So typically what happens is that you'll put in 3% of your salary, and your employer will match that with an additional 3%, and there are different things that you can do. And that's the sort of thing that we need to start moving towards. Now, what the state did do just recently, because, people realize even though they don't really quite know what to do, they do realize that we're in for a serious problem in the future. And they made a couple of tweaks to the system, and one of those tweaks was for all employees that were hired as of, I think it was July 1st, 2012. They now have to wait till 65 to retire, and the calculation is based on a different accrual factor, which is a little bit too complicated for radio, but also it's a 5-year average salary instead of a 3-year average salary at the end. So what that did, that small reform, what that did was save taxpayers about $1.2 billion over 30 years and reduce that unfunded liability by about $2.9 billion over that 30-year period as well. So that shows that legislators do realize that something has to happen so that these people who are working for the state now, in fact, do have a pension in the future, but also so that your children and grandchildren aren't going to get hit with some massive tax bill to bail out a system that is fundamentally unsustainable.
And now, do the people who are currently, and I guess this would depend on who you talk to, but pensioners across the state of Wyoming, do they realize the scope of the problem at this point? Or, I'd love to see a poll.
I don't really think so, because yesterday the state compensation committee was meeting. So you've got a couple of legislators and some people from the private sector, and what they do is review government pay policy, basically. And it was actually not a bad meeting, because you could see that the legislators realized that we just can't afford to continue to pay huge amounts to these bureaucrats. We just with the potential for falling severance tax revenue, where is the money going to come from? Now, what they did then later was open up the meeting to public comment, and I think, and there were 3 written comments, and 2 of them had to do with pensions. One was, I really want to be able to retire sooner, and that's just not going to happen. And the other was, well, I really need a cost of living increase, because the other major reform that was made by the state legislator over the last year or 2 was to eliminate in all but one of the 8 or 9 pension plans that the state has the cost of living increase. Now, this also goes to private sector equity, because in the private sector, when you retire, you get your pension, and that's it. You don't get a cost of living increase over the years. This is one of the reasons why we've got such a big unfunded liability right now. It's almost $2 billion. That's money that's just not there to pay retirees in the future. But I don't think people are really too aware, because this is another thing I'll be writing about more over the next while, and that is that the state has got about $16 billion in what a lot of legislators call coffee cans around the budget.
Right.
So I think a lot of people have got this idea that, well, if we really need to, we can just take some money out of some of these permanent savings accounts, and bail out the pension plan. Well, were those savings accounts? Really, the fact that Wyoming has got $16 billion in savings accounts, what that says is that we are overtaxing the minerals industry, and the sales taxes are way too high, because those are the 2 main sources of taxes for the state government. But has all that money been saved up to preserve crucial spending during big economic downturns, or is it to bail out bad management decisions? And I would say that, really, the fact that you've got all this money means not that you need to be irresponsible, but that you need to actually be more responsible and save that should there be a big economic downturn coming up in the future.
Maureen, it looks to me like even though they took a stab at fixing the Wyoming pension problems, really all they did was kick that coffee can you were talking about down the road a little bit. Does it eventually come back on taxpayers if they keep going this way?
Oh, well, yes, absolutely. One of the things that is kind of crazy about the state retirement system is that, remember I mentioned before that normally what happens if you've got a pension plan is you've got the employee contribution and the employer contribution. And what that leads people to believe is that state employees are actually contributing to their own retirement. Well, that actually wasn't true until just recently, which it was a little bit mind-boggling to think that the employee contribution, in other words, what the state bureaucrats are paying out of their own pocket for their own retirement was actually paid for by state taxpayers, because of course the employer of state bureaucrats is in fact the taxpayers. When you talk about, well, the government employees, who pays that? Well, it's the taxpayers who pay for that. Now, that's all started back in 1979 because there was a bit of a pushback against higher bureaucrat salaries. And so what the state did was say, okay, we're going to start paying a portion of your pension plan contribution. So this kind of escalated out of control, and by 1991, the legislature authorized state agencies to pay 100% of the employee pension contribution. But then what happened in 2008? Well, we had this great big recession. The severance taxes go down, sales taxes go down. Suddenly the government is looking at a bit of a fiscal squeeze, and it's saying, oh, gee, maybe employees should actually contribute something to their own pension. So at the time, there was about, my little chart here, there was a 14.12% contribution from the state employee's salary into the pension plan. Well, of that 14.12%, the employee himself would only pay 1.343%. So in other words, taxpayers picked up 90% of the contribution to the pension plan. And that's now something that's sort of slowly changing. So from going from having to pay 100% of the employee and employer contribution, taxpayers are now paying only 90%, which I suppose is better than 100%, but it's still not good enough.
Right.
And so that's one of the things we need to start doing, is seeing a move towards having government workers pay equally into their own pension plan. Otherwise, we're never going to achieve any kind of taxpayer equity in this system.
So I got about 2.5 minutes here. What is your dream solution for this problem in Wyoming?
Well, as we said at the beginning, you've got these retirees. Can you imagine if you're 80 and suddenly the state says, we're going to completely change your pension plan, and that's not something that you can really do to somebody who's in their 80s, So what we're looking at wanting to do is for new employees starting at the state, they would move into a defined contribution pension plan, just like the people who are in the private sector. That's really what we need to start doing, because what that does is stop the accrual of more of this pension debt, and it starts shifting the risk from taxpayers, from your children, future taxpayers, right, your children and grandchildren, to the employees that work at the state themselves. That's what we need to start moving towards. Okay.
Are you having, I think you sent me a note, you're having some kind of a conference, a get-together on this?
Yeah, so what we've done is partnered with the Reason Foundation, and they're going to bring Dan Liljenquist, who is a former Utah state senator and sort of the person who spearheaded some extremely serious reform in his own state, here to Cheyenne, Wyoming on October the 6th. We've got a day-long seminar we're planning. This seminar has actually garnered some regional interest. We're going to have legislators from other states coming in as well. We'll talk about the different kinds of options that state legislators can move towards, so that we can bring some sort of pension reality to the state pension plan. So we're getting our invitation list ready. We'll be inviting the legislators, the Wyoming retirement system, and the media as well, because we need to have other people in the media understand just what the issue really is and what realistic solutions are as well. Because if we don't start moving towards those solutions, do you really want to have your little kids paying huge taxes later for somebody else's retirement? I don't think so.
And what day of the week is this going to be?
It's going to be on a Monday.
Oh, see, I was going to ask for a media pass. That's a school night for me. I can't do that, Maureen.
Yeah, it's just a quick drive. Huh?
Oh, yeah. All right, Maureen, thanks for coming on. Interesting as always.
Always great to be here. Thank you. Bye now.